Welcome to episode 20 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. Have you overlooked the Barber Museum in Alabama? I know I have, but it's 30 years old this year, and it's time to drop in to see what is going on. The museum's communication director, Robert Pandya, is our guest this week. And if you're about to listen to the audio-only version on advrider.com, I'd suggest you hop over to YouTube and check out the video version of our chat as we're illustrating our conversation with photographs. But before we dive in, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, and naturally, exclusions apply. Shall we take the plunge? Robert, it's been a while since the Barber Museum came on the scene, and there was so much interest when it first opened. And I think some of us, and I include myself in this, have sort of forgotten about it. So let's do a little recap on the Barber Museum, how it came about, the man behind it, and where you are today with it.
Yeah, it's really an incredible place. You know, this year is our 30th anniversary of the museum entity. You know, it's a 501c3. It's a charitable trust that runs this thing, and the common misconception is Mr. Barber has a closet full of keys and could come grab a key and go ride any one of his motorcycles anytime or that sort of thing. But in reality, it started when Mr. Barber originally, he's a sports car guy. And he used to race Porsches in his youth in Germany, and got trained by, the Ferrari factory and how to race and stuff like that. And he was a sports car guy, and he wanted to have an amazing sports car museum, but it was kind of too late. A lot of that stuff was already sucked up. It's really expensive. It's in different museums. But a friend of his said, nobody's really done a great job of a motorcycle museum. And he decided to commit to that. And that was 30 years ago that it started. And it started in a warehouse building in Birmingham, Alabama. And 3 years later, the Art of the Motorcycle happened, that famous show at the Guggenheim in New York City. And Mr. Barber was approached by a gentleman named Alton Guilfoyle, and 22 of the motorcycles in that exhibit, so fully about 30% of the bikes, were supplied by Mr. Barber, and is at that time like 3-year-old museum. And that was really one of the things that elevated the provenance of the museum. Then soon after, he outgrew the warehouse facility. The land that we're on with the Barber Museum now is former U.S. Steel land, and he made a deal with the city of Birmingham to expand the exit off of Interstate 20. The exit's actually in the town of Leeds, but then it doubles back. The entrance doubles back, so we're actually in Birmingham proper. And he built this building that you see there. And the core part of the building, the main part that the logo is on, is 20 years old. And then the annex, which is that dark window section shooting off to the side, that was built around 2017, I believe. This view inside is, I'm actually sitting just on the other side of that elevator tower in our restoration shop. It's a total of 6 stories high, including the restoration level basement, and 230,000 square feet with 1,800 plus motorcycles, and about 1,200 of those or so are on display. And then we have the world's largest collection of Lotus race cars and sports cars as well, even bigger than Classic Team Lotus back in England. So that's where it all came about. It's not only the museum, but the Barber Motorsports Park includes a racetrack. And the racetrack is
speaking
well
of
known.
which,
Yeah, there you go. That's a great shot. That's the back of the museum. And that bridge, actually, that bridge is interesting. Mr. Barber commissioned that bridge, and that the only way you can get on that bridge is to go through the museum. So you may buy a ticket to go to the IndyCar race or Moto America or something like that, but if you want to see the best view of the track, you've got to come through the museum. So that's a dead end bridge that just goes across to like one of the prettiest spots where you can watch the starting grid of the track and everything. So Mr. Barber he's got a really keen eye. He's a perfectionist in a lot of ways. He's 84 years old this year and still kicking around. He comes into the museum 2 to 3 times a week just to check in on us, and always asks, like as he leaves, he's like, let me know if I can do anything for you. You know, he's a very generous, gregarious man, and is proud of this, but he's not. He's very humble about this, and he built this place as much to showcase enthusiasm for motorsports, not just motorcycles, but motorsports, as much as he is proud of being from Birmingham, Alabama, and wanting to promote this area, bring people to the area.
Now, Robert, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Barber's fortune came from dairy farming. Is that? Do I have that right?
That's right. He was born into a dairy family. So Barber Dairy was like the brand of milk in the area. You know, everything, ice cream, and you name it. And as that business grew, he eventually sold it to another bigger dairy entity, and that's sort of kickstarted the museum. And he's still in Barber Companies is one of the biggest landholders in the state of Alabama, private landholder, and has a lot of commercial businesses, shopping centers, and office complexes. So you get a sense of where the skill set came from to build this, palace to motorsports. When you look at this, the building and the layout.
One of the questions I always have, and I think museum curators and museum staffers the world over, irrespective of whatever they're showing, if they're showing artwork or vehicles or sculpture or anything, is how do you make and we talked about this before we came on here, but how do you make a museum relevant when you can see everything online? It used to be, of course, if you wanted to see a race, you had to go stand in a corner. If you wanted to see a motorcycle, you had to go to a meet. But we've seen most of the bikes in the museum, or many of them, in photographs. So how do you keep it relevant today?
There's a spot. That's a great question. And there's a spot inside the museum that I call our wow spot. And it's just you pay your ticket and you get in and you breach this certain section of the wall, and all of a sudden your view opens up. It's very Romanesque in that way. It's like all of a sudden you see this place, and the wow hits you, and you realize, I've seen this photograph, but it's different when you're there. And it's a lot like any national monument. Yeah, you can see a picture of the Lincoln Memorial. You can see a picture of the Senate building or something like that in DC. And then when you're standing there, the gravity of the place, the feel of the place, the sound of it, we're usually once or twice a day, there's something getting fired up in the basement, and the sound of an engine carrying through that place doesn't get conveyed in a photograph. And trust me, as a former photographer myself, I know a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the live experience is worth 1,000,000. And that's really the point, is making the trek to come here and seeing these motorcycles in 3 dimensions, being able to stick your face right into them. We don't have glass panels and ropes and that sort of thing. We don't want you touching the bikes, obviously, but but you can get right up and look right into these bikes and see the details and that kind of thing. And I think that 100 pictures of any one motorcycle is not the same as being in the presence of that bike. The other part of it too, and this is the humanity part, is all through the museum are people who love the same thing. And so you're going to meet somebody who's maybe come in from um, from another part of the country, and you guys are going to share stories about the 0 mile VFR 1000 that we have on display. That was one of our first bikes in the collection, by the way. And it's just like, what that meant to you, and seeing it in a bike magazine, and and that excitement. And I think that that's the part that, as we get into like sort of an internet rebound generationally, that's a much bigger conversation, but there's this desire for analog, there's this desire for experience, and I think that's what the museum offers, and we're keenly aware of being welcoming hosts to people and giving them their own space to discover this place.
You're listening to The Lowdown Show, presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. One of the things I've wondered when I've been at the Barber is, what is the criteria for putting a bike into your collection? Because sometimes I'll look around and I'll think, well, that seems kind of plain. I've seen that BMW or I've seen that Ducati before. But I guess the point is you sort of have an agnostic view, which is that anything that has some significance, you incorporate. So how does that work? Who decides, first of all, and why?
There's a gentleman named Brian Slark, and I would be remiss not to mention his name. He was a internationally famous Norton mechanic out of California, and just as he was creeping up towards a proper retirement, Mr. Barber snatched him up and got him to come to Birmingham. He curated a ton of motorcycles that are in the display. And he's got great taste. I mean, he's been around it. He's in Hall of Fames. He's just one of those names that's just known particularly in the British motorcycle community and the vintage motorcycle community. So he had a big hand in the motorcycle collection that's here. And there are others who weigh in, board members who certainly have an opinion about, hey, this is a neat motorcycle. It should be part of our thing. We did have a big buying spree in the 90s, as we're creeping towards building this place, we need to fill it, right? And at the time, the paltry 500-600 motorcycles that were in the warehouse museum didn't seem like enough to fill the place. So a bunch of bikes got purchased in that area. And I do get a question of, so like, why is there a Bergman 650 scooter?
Yeah, why? Come on, why?
Why, man? And why is it, there's a Honda VTX 1300, right? Not a particularly noteworthy motorcycle from a technological standpoint or whatever, but it's that human connectivity part that we really try to be agnostic categorically, and agnostic certainly by brand. I mean, there's like 222 brands or something like that inside this building, and
so you're not snob.
What might no, exactly. My point is what might not be an important motorcycle to one person may be the motorcycle that got him into riding, and there's that connection there. So there are in fact 2 YSR 50s here, and that was my first race bike that I got to race. And every time I walk past one of those bikes, I'm like, do we need to? Can I maybe get a hold of one of those and put it back in my? But I mean, there's just that connection and that story, and it's about having touchable motorcycles as well as an untouchable bike like a Superleggera or a Supermono or a an MV Tamburini that we have on display, or John Surtees MV championship bike. These are all like untouchable things to most humans, and so it's cool to see it and be around it, but to see like an FZR 600 that I used to lust after, after putting down the pages of Sport Rider magazine, that's that connection that is so important in the museum.
And of course, motorcycles aren't just the vehicles. I mean, I would argue that the more interesting thing about motorcycles are the people that surround them and that race them and that fix them, and the friendships we make around it, because of a common interest. And certainly one of the things, and you were telling me earlier, and we have this photograph, which is Kenny Roberts Sr. and Kenny Roberts Jr., and he is flanking. You're going to remind me of the gentleman's name?
Yeah, that's Brian Case. He's our new museum director.
So what is the significance of this photograph?
Well, this was taken in April at Circuit of the Americas, and it's when we announced that the KR Racing, Kenny Roberts Racing Collection, is now permanently part of the Barber Museum. And the yellow bike is the iconic YZR 500 that Kenny Roberts raced. This exact motorcycle is very rare, is because it has an aluminum frame that was actually painted black to hide the fact that it was aluminum from the competition. And that was very, very technologically ahead of the competition back in the day.
Yeah.
So this bike in 1980 won the first 3 races of the Grand Prix Championship. And then they switched the engine configuration, went back to a steel frame. But he went on to go ahead and win. He won 78, 79, and 1980 all in a row. So Kenny Roberts it's not just about the championships, because he also, in that drive to the championships, he won the Grand Slam, American, Grand Slam, where you win like short track, long track, TT, road racing, and something else I'm forgetting that one of your listeners is screaming at the screen right now. Tell me what it is. But anyway, he won like all these 5 races in 1 year. He did it in 1 year, like road racing championship, I think. So anyway, this guy did some incredible stuff. He went on to challenge the World Racing Organization and significantly uplift rider safety for international racing, because some of the tracks they used to race on were absolutely, you would barely want to drive your rental car on some of these tracks, as scary as they were.
Yes.
And that's what they were forced to race. And he started a rider boycott and started an alternate race series, and really rattled the international racing community as to the needs for riders. Then he went on to win. He won 4 championships for Yamaha, 3 of them on that series of motorcycles, and then he won with Wayne Rainey, running the factory Yamaha team. And then he went on to become his own constructor with the Proton Modena era, with the KR3 and KR5 Grand Prix bikes. So that's why Kenny Sr. is so important, and why this picture is so important is Kenny Jr., who rode the blue Suzuki there. Kenny Jr. and Kenny Sr. are the only father-son to win World Grand Prix Championship. And those 2 motorcycles are 20 years apart. So in 2000, Junior won on that very bike, that specific motorcycle. It's not a Bitsa bike that's put together with, frame from here and a replica fairing and stuff like that. This is the actual bike. And when you look into the radiator of the bike, you can actually see bugs from Rio, the last race where he took 6th place to clinch the championship. And that number 1 plate, you can kind of just see it in that photograph. It's a sticker slapped on top of the number 2 that he went into the season with. And that's his mechanic put that sticker on the bike, and that sticker has not been peeled off the bike. The bike literally has brake dust, on the rims from the race. And that's why it's significant. We were able to tell this American racing legacy for generations to come. And that's the reason that the Roberts family decided that the Barber Museum was the right place to have it. And Senior is actually going to be our Grand Marshal for our October Barber Vintage Festival event. And anytime Senior and Junior are together at a motorcycle event, it's a good time for sure.
Well, Kenny Roberts is such a notorious badass, and as a former
Yeah.
amateur flat tracker myself, of course, he won the 2 AMA flat track titles on parallel twin Yamahas, and then went over and ruffled everyone's feathers in Europe, as you alluded to. Now, as you were talking, Robert, I just thought of something, and sort of the curatorial process and the way that we view old motorcycles has changed, I think, in the 30 years that the museum has come into being. Now, you're fairly new at Barber, but there was a point where everything, any old motorcycle was just restored to as new perfection. But then there's been a real change of heart, hasn't there? Where now what's really valued, and you see this in the sort of the Harley crowd, and some of the, you see old panheads and knuckleheads and stuff, and if you find one that's original and rusty and crusty, I mean, they ultimately carry, I think, so much more interest, and the marketplace has spoken, and they're more valuable, because a restored whatever is just sort of generic. But when you see the warts and all, just like we have, we age, we get scars, we gain character, at least we hope so. So how has that, do you think, influenced the way, or has it influenced the way the Barber Museum works?
Yeah, it's I mean, when I first saw the museum 27 years ago, in the Birmingham warehouse, which is a story, racing with Jeff Nash at in Savannah out at Roebling Road, and we we're coming across the country, and I got a sneak peek into this museum, and so then I've run track days here for Aprilia in my career, and intro products and stuff like that. So seeing the process of the museum grow has been really important. Not every bike here has gone. I'm sitting in the restoration shop. Behind me is Jared Mee's championship, Indian. We're not going to pull that motorcycle apart and polish bolts and put it all back together. It's got its dings and scuffs, and it tells the story of its racing career, and that's important. So the bikes do get evaluated by our director, Brian Case, and by other staffers to decide, does it still have its original nuts and bolts on it? Does it, has it been previously messed with? And if at a certain point somebody's done a bad restoration, or the bike is deserving of a little more attention, then it'll go in through that process. But I think the human story, Mr. Barber did not want a dark building full of dead motorcycles, is one of his quotes.
Well put.
And so both sides of our building are lined with windows the entire way up. And it's a big, bright, light building. And the fact that the restoration shop puts out motorcycles, that 99% of the motorcycles that are on display in the public area can get oil, gas, coolant if necessary, can get checked over, and can get fired up. So anything that's up on display, that includes, the Britain, that includes, whatever. It has the potential of getting fired up. So that was the most important part, is we don't have bikes with like empty crankcases and I call it bits of bikes that are just assembled from mishmash of stuff. We try and pay attention to that and keep telling that story as well. So I think a person I used to work with, Mike Wolf from Antique Archaeology, used to call, those old Harleys, called it rusty gold, right? And he spoke about the fact that these motorcycles are only original once. And then when you start to take them apart and start to, I'll polish this, I'll fix that, I'll do that, then you get further and further away from the story of that bike. So that's really... I think that's something that's taken a hold of the entire industry, and that patina and that history is worth something.
I totally agree. I think it's much more interesting. As sort of a silly aside, when I look at my first time through the Barber Museum, and this is for me as an enthusiast by the 10-foot square garden shed for my 2 old Ducatis, but I think, how can you keep track of the batteries and the oil filters for 1,000 motorcycles? Like, how does one? Now, of course, you have a whole staff, and I'm being flippant, but that was the first thing I was like, oh my God,
Yeah, I think if Mr. Barber were particularly angry at me for some reason, I think a death sentence would be, would you go check the tire pressures inside the museum? I think that alone would be.
You may have just given him some ammunition, so I'd keep your
Oh
nose.
yeah,
I'd keep
I
your
do
nose
that on.
clean.
Trust me, I do that on a weekly basis. But there is a terrific staff here, and we have an unbelievable number of docents who care and volunteers who come in, and they, just like us, Neil. They just want to be around it. They just want to see these things. And the volunteers, when you come in on a big event weekend for Barber Vintage Festival or something, they wear red polo shirts. You can pick them out. And our docents wear white shirts like these. And it's just, without them, it would be impossible. And they really just do a great job. The prior picture you showed of all the motorcycles on stacked up, at a certain point, we got to check the tire pressures and they need a dusting. So about twice a year, we bring in this gigantic industrial man lift and have to go up and dust everything. So it's a process just to keep the place presentable and keep it looking fresh, so that somebody, when they come in and they have that wow moment, they are as excited by the presentation as somebody who came in on day one.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. This week's Fireside Chat is about a collection of motorcycles. Now, the Barber Museum has over 1,000 on display, and then others that aren't on display. That seems excessive in this era of belt tightening. So I'm going to go with 5. Number 1, KTM 950 Adventure in black. It looks like something that's Austrian Army surplus. Great sound, focused, incredibly uncomfortable seat. But that's my ADV bike of choice. Always has been. It's never changed. Number 2, Ducati Superleggera. Very simply because magnesium and titanium are chrome for the enlightened enthusiast. Number 3, Harley Panhead Chopper. I know you don't need to tell me. It's a total guilty pleasure that can't be justified. But I grew up in a town with a lot of outlaw bikers. And in the 70s, Panhead and shovelhead choppers were all that I saw. And I think it's called imprinting. That's number 3, Chopper. Number 4, Aprilia RSV4, because of the sound. It is the best sounding motorcycle ever. It is so beautiful, rich, sonorous, raucous, sophisticated, unsophisticated, everything all in one motorcycle. Number 5, a Ducati MotoGP bike with my own personal doctor, a hospital, and a staff of nurses. And of course, then an entire staff to run the bike, because I don't know how they work, because I will be falling off and it will be ugly. So those are my 5. What are your 5? And now a word from our sponsor. With over 122 million parts, you can make sure your number one ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, and naturally exclusions apply. Now back to my conversation with Robert Pandya. You're listening to The Lowdown Show, presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. Now, Robert, we're going to step aside from the Barber Museum for a minute just to get a little bit more of your history. Now, I've known you, I think, I first saw you when you were dealing with Polaris. I believe you were involved with Indian, and were you involved with Victory for a while as well?
Yeah, actually, I was fortunate to start. I was with Polaris as a contractor for 10 years. And the first product I introduced was the Victory Vision. So that was jumping into the deep end of controversy right there on the American V-twin scene, as you can imagine.
Oh, boy.
And and I still love that bike to this day. So
Oh, boy.
just because some people hate it. So being a contrarian, and a Moto Guzzi owner, I'm like, yeah, that's a good way.
Oh, you're one of them. Okay. Well, now I get who you are.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, the decade in working alongside Polaris with Victory, and then I also in parallel, I worked with Indian for 4 years. So my agency took care of all the Victory PR and all the Indian PR subsequent to the acquisition of Indian by Polaris. And I remember that, like, the first press release I wrote for Victory, the little footer on the bottom said Polaris. It was like at the time it was like a $1.8 billion company. Now they're over. I think they're like 7 or something like that. So the growth in the past 15 years of that company has been incredible, and to be able to present really important projects. Like within the Victory world, we did Project 156 with Roland Sands, and we raced up Pikes Peak. Victory, or Polaris at the time, acquired Bramo. So we had 1 year we raced both a gas version of a bike and an electric bike. So up Pikes Peak, which is pretty cool for an American brand, right? And then with Indian, I had the opportunity to launch the Chief and the Scout and the Wrecking Crew and the Spirit of Monroe, which was the long streamliner that we built to introduce the motor, the new Chief motor at the time, which ironically you can't see the motor inside the bike, but that's okay. Anyway, so just being a part to that history is really great. And that built on, prior to that, where for 10 years I was the PR guy for Aprilia and Moto Guzzi in the US as well. So, so 10 years with sort of Piaggio group brands, 10 years with Polaris group brands, and then doing IMS shows. Being the spokesperson for the IMS shows as they toured nationally was a big thing. I used to run track days for Buell. I've had a fortunate career thanks to a lot of really fantastic mentors and people who gave me a long leash to do the weird thing that I do in the weird way that I do it.
Now, you've also done a lot of riding, and so that segues into this bike. And
oh yeah,
tell me the story of first of all, tell me this bike, and then what your connection is to it.
Yeah, this is a pedigreed Dakar bike, raced in Dakar. I'm not sure what year, but it's a real full factory KTM race bike, Red Bull KTM race bike, and all the fantasy of Dakar is like absolutely, the low slung pipe, the multiple gas tanks. It's got something like a 19, a custom 19 plate clutch system. Right. So it's horrible to get going. Basically, you just do a burnout every single time you take off. Basically, it's got no transition zones, binary clutch, right? And so this bike and 4 others like it, all different pedigreed bikes for Dakar, were owned by a gentleman named James Embro. And James invited a bunch of his friends that included a gentleman named John Sawaski, who rode this particular bike. Chris Carter, who owns a Motion Pro tool company and cable company. A great guy named Mucho Bill, who owns the biggest limousine company in the Bay Area. Gentleman named Eric Anderson, who you must know as inside the motorcycle industry. He's been an industry guy forever. And of course, James Embro all rode these bikes. And I was brought along, the cartoon where it's like all the big dogs and then there's the yappy little dog around. That was me. And I was going to ride a DRZ 400, and all these guys were just giving me hell for that. And so I went out and got a hold of a street legalized KTM MXC 450 with a tiny little headlight and a dinky little tail light and the license plate dangling by a zip tie. And we rode the entire length of the Trans Am Trail on that little cadre of motorcycles.
How long a ride is that?
That's what is that, 4,900 or 40? I forget what it is, but it's Jellicoe, Tennessee, pretty much as far east as you can go in Tennessee, all the way to the coast in Oregon but dipping through Colorado, the south eastern corner of Colorado, and going up that way, and Moab, Utah, and all that. But that's the Trans Am Trail, as your readers certainly know, is as far as you can go across country in a relatively off-road scenario. And we did that ride. I got to write a story called the Go Big Ride for Motorcyclist magazine, and photograph it, and be the yappy little dog, screaming along on a 450 next to these Dakar, 690s and whatever that were just roosting me the entire time. So.
And that's a lot of miles on a very narrow seat.
I stood up 2/3 of the way across this country, brother. I tell you what, that I had calves like a monster by the end of the ride.
I'm surprised you've been able to sit down at all ever since.
I had to sit down to do valve adjustments once a week, and an oil change in the parking lot every 3 days. That was the routine to keep the 450 alive. So.
Well, since we're talking about long distances, let's have a look at this bike, and tell me a bit about this one.
This is really cool. This is Gary Egan's Ducati St4, and he set a cross-country record. It was 36 hours and a few minutes on that motorcycle. He was out of Utah.
And sorry, that was a coast-to-coast run, correct?
Yes. And really, incredible guy, and just such a pleasant, nice guy. I first met him in Salt Lake City. And he actually used to tour when I was the spokesperson for the IMS tours, along with my other 15 jobs I had at the same time. He used to come to the IMS tours and would present long distance touring, and how do you modify the bike? How do you prepare your body? How do you prepare your mind for something like this? And that ST4, him doing that on a Ducati, which at that time, that era, Ducatis were, they're fragile and they're belt-driven cams, and they need a tune-up. Every time you go to a Starbucks, it's going to need a tune-up, and and that kind of thing. And and he proved that wrong with that motorcycle. So he, pretty incredible bike, and it's got a bunch of dirt and scratches and dings, and it tells the story of a well-ridden Ducati.
I remember when he did those trips, and I think everyone thought he was mad. Well, first of all, just to do that sort of distance is one thing, but secondly, to do it on a Ducati at the time, as you said, with Desmo valve adjustments, and the recommended mileage between the adjustments was not very long at the time. They've increased it since then, but it was totally a mad thing. And speaking of distance, we also have this Super Tenere.
Yeah, that is Longhul Paul's bike. So you can still see his adventures at longhulpaul.com. And that motorcycle is equally crusty and beat up. And there's still his Camelback is on there. I noticed that slung from the back of his auxiliary fuel tank across to the front of the bike. And there's still a phone in the phone mount, and bugs all over it and dirt all over it. And so Paul, he, for a couple of seasons, he did the entire IMS tour, and that tour crisscrossed around the country, and he did the entire tour riding that motorcycle. In fact, the custom license plate on the back of that bike is NOCAR, NOCAR, and he really interesting guy. Did a lot of work for charity in this. He used to do a lot of seminars and that sort of thing, and people think of the Barber as, racing and motorsports. It's in the title of the place, but I'm an adventure rider myself. Obviously, I love that. I think it's the coolest way to see the country and to explore places and to open up possibilities. And the adventure riding segment is something that is growing more and more and more into being critical for the motorcycle industry, and an important part of the museum.
I guess part of the museum mandate is to maintain a certain degree of relevance, and so you have to be aware of what's trending. And of course, I think the rise of the ADV bike is really curious, because it is kind of the standard motorcycle of our age, isn't it? You know, sport touring bikes are sort of non-existent or less and less all the time.
Right.
And I think which is kind of funny when you think about it, because it really is just the seating position is classic dirt bike. And who knew that that's the best sort of most comfortable way to sit on a motorcycle for any degree of distance. And so the rise of it, and I guess the museum ultimately will reflect that, won't it?
Yeah, it will. And, you know, I mean, in my time with Indian and doing the research back on all of that, obviously, you know, when you think back to like a 1936 Chief, or even further back to Cannonball Baker's, you know, ride across the country, and what was that, 11, right? Or was it 4? No, it was 11. No, it was 14. 1914. And it's not like there was a paved highway. Every bike was an adventure bike. I mean, that's, you know,
Right.
some of the, I mean, that's just, it was a bike. So it was a thing with 2 wheels and a motor, and it was probably a dirt or gravel road if you were lucky. And, you know, there's a reason that Model Ts were so successful back in that era with their tall, skinny wheels, is because they would sink into these muddy ruts, and they needed that height to get through. Well, motorcycles could get in and around that muck. And so every bike back then was an adventure bike. So I think it's kind of ironic that in the over a century of history that's inside this building, you see bikes that particularly in our vintage zone, that were ridden in the crappiest conditions.
Yeah.
And they had exposed valve trains, you know, where you had to put a little cup of grease on the tappets for your daily ride, and those were ridden in absolutely horrific conditions. But that's just what it was. So adventure riding, I think, ironically, is circling back around to the roots of motorcycling, which is, I just want to get there, and there might not be paved, so I got to figure it out, and I'm going to go. And I've seen in my time as an adventure rider and owning, excuse me, owning a KTM 950 and a 1290, and riding plenty of 690s and 450s, and let's see, what a Guzzi 85 TT, having some time on BMWs and Triumphs and the like, is the you know, adventure is maturing into where there's like touring adventure, just like sport bikes from the 90s. There's like touring GT-ish bikes, and then you swing back the other direction, and there's like a Touareg 660, you know, which is snappy and light, and, you know, and can go down the highway at 75 miles an hour all the time, but really wants to dive into that, you know, 2-track road and go bombing around Moab. And to me, adventure is the most exciting current segment, not just because of a volume of sales, but it's being driven by an enthusiast sensibility in the marketplace that the OEMs are having to address. And the OEMs are hearing from, oh man, these bikes are getting too big, they're getting too heavy, they're getting too complicated. And all of a sudden there's like the technology that's on the big bikes is making their way to the middleweight bikes. Well, if you take that entire storyline and lay it over the late 80s, early 90s sport bike scene, you know, we've seen this before.
Yeah, exactly.
So we know where it's going to go. And I think you know, everything old is new again, but ultimately adventure hooks into that wanderlust of 2 wheels and an engine in a way that a 1908 Thor did.
To swing our conversation sort of back to the Barber to sort of wrap things up, I think the stroke of genius when Mr. Barber built the facility was the inclusion of a racetrack, because that really, to me, and I've done, I haven't raced at Barber, but I've done press launches there, and just for whatever reason, when you come off a vintage road race in my own time, but the idea that you come off a track and you're sweaty, and then you can go see a museum, and you're still like, you still have that sort of adrenaline from having ridden. And I mean, obviously it's a great way to exercise the bikes that you have, and not every bike that you have, you really want to get out on the interstate and go to Birmingham on.
That's true.
So, you get to exercise, but also you host a couple of really significant events, and maybe you can take me through some of those events, Robert.
Yeah, absolutely. The racetrack's amazing. It's like 2.3-ish miles, 17 turns, has 80 feet of elevation change. And as you know from riding here, it can be a technical track. I mean, you can
Absolutely.
piddle along and kind of cruise and be fine. But when you want to go fast, you'd better be paying attention. And it's really challenging in that aspect. The museum, there's a driveway that pulls out of the back of the museum here and drops right down into a private entrance into the track. So when we need to exercise one of the vehicles, we've just got access into the track nice and easy and can pull back in and tuck back into the museum. And I remember very specifically, it was a Buell track day I was running, and it was lunchtime. And the second all the corner workers came in for lunch, all of a sudden this little red sports car came out of the museum and was ripping around the track. And we're like, what is that thing, And the track is an integral part of the park. And we call it a park because that's what Mr. Barber wanted. He wanted to build a park that has a racetrack around it. And Neil, I don't know if you've had a chance to walk the trails, like through the trees or anything like that.
No, I haven't. No.
It's really great. There's like hidden sculptures in the trees. There's no grandstands. I don't know if you ever really noticed that, but there's no like sort of assigned seating. We don't do that here. It's rolling hills, and you bring your own lawn chair, or you throw a blanket out on a nice grassy lawn and watch the race. Very European style. So that was influenced by Mr. Barber's early experience with European racetracks. Is there weren't a bunch of stupid bleachers to sit down, that you were encouraged to move around. And by making the trails interactive in the sense of did you see the dog sculpture or the zombies over here or whatever it is, right? Really encourages you to get up and move around and see the racing. So some of the events that happen here are we have one of the biggest events is the Indy car race, which is really incredible. Those cars are just phenomenal machines, and it's a very approachable event. As big as it is, it's much easier to deal with than the actual Indy 500. And to see the cars cornering and screaming around is amazing. I think there's one spot on the track where they hit like 142 miles an hour, and like I said, you've been on this track, and that's no mean feat.
It's quite. I mean, it's just, if I can jump in, I think it's a sort of a perfect scale track, especially for club level racers, because unlike a track like Circuit of the Americas in Austin, which is 190 miles an hour, it's a real flow track, and technical, as you said, and second, third, fourth gear track, and it kind of it keeps you honest, but it flatters your capabilities, which I think we
I really think
we do that. Yeah.
I really think this track makes you better. Any track can make you better. I think that this track makes you better every single time, and it's such a beautiful place to ride through that his mandate was to build the park with a racetrack in it. And the track manager, a really hardworking guy named Mark Witt, who's been with him for 30 plus years, Mr. Barber told him, hey, I want to make a racetrack. And Mark said, well, I suppose I should go visit some racetracks. I've never built a racetrack before. And Mr. Barber said to Mark that if you go to a racetrack before you build mine, I'm going to fire you. He wanted a park that had a racetrack in it. And Mark built a just absolutely beautiful place that looks like a premium subdivision anywhere you look, to the point that our tire barriers are wrapped in white vinyl because Mr. Barber didn't like the look of, a bunch of junky looking tires, sitting out there, right? All the gravel traps are groomed like you expect out of, I don't know, the Honda test track in Japan or something.
It's more like a golf course, truly.
Yes,
isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, his reference was the Augusta National. He wanted to build the Augusta racetrack. So literally, it is like a golf course here.
But not snobby, which is nice. I like.
No, man, we're gearheads. It's totally cool. Right. There's grease under the fingernails around here. It's all right. So we have the IndyCar race, as you mentioned. We have SRO, which is a sports car racing event. We have a smaller track that we call the Proving Grounds that hosts the Alabama SCCA for autocross. We've had mini bike endurance racing out there. We have had supermoto events and vintage motorcycle events. Wira holds a national here. Moto America, of course, I'd be remiss not to add them. Of course, they're here. ARMA's big event is their biggest event of the year is concurrent with the Barber Vintage Festival, which is coming up second weekend of October. So I'll get my plug in. I hope.
Yeah, let's take a minute and talk about that, because I think it's.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't been to the vintage event, although I've been meaning to go and race my Ducati for years. But it really shocks people, because most vintage events are fairly low key and there's no spectators, and it's real club racing, it's a small time club racing. But then once we get to your facility, things change, and the crowds, and apparently it's an amazing thing. So can you tell me a bit more about what you would see there if I went down in October?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, the museum itself has special programming. As we said before, Kenny Roberts Sr. is the Grand Marshal, and we're going to be doing some special stuff inside the museum with him for our museum members and that kind of thing. So the museum is it full glory, for that event. Every day we'll be starting engines at 10 and 2. So where you put your hands on the steering wheel, 10 and 2, we're firing up engines right here in the museum and inviting people down into this restoration shop, which is normally closed to the public. Then there's also a massive swap meet, 500 plus vendors, and they completely fill a huge section of the park that we've had to expand over time. And the swap meet is amazing. So it's good timing. It's October, so you're going to be working on stuff in the wintertime. So it's a good time to come in and pick up those bits and pieces you're going to need to complete the Zundap or whatever it is you're working on, right? And then there's also events that happen off-road. We have built a new off-road like motocross racetrack, but it's a vintage style motocross racetrack. So not huge doubles. It's through the trees, and it's part of the park, and it is going to be dressed out and as beautiful as the road racing facility and the museum itself. And then the main track itself hosts the ARMA racing. And ARMA, I think, is, and you're part of the scene, you know this, Neil, inherently, but the paddock is open. People are cool. They want you to see these bikes. They want you to hear these bikes. They want to answer questions. You meet, the coolest people in these paddocks that have real history, and they may not be, world famous racers, but they all have an interesting story to tell. It's the biggest sidecar racing event in North America. Happens here, and those things are just spectacular and so weird in their own way that it's just you got to see that. And then there's also a fan zone, and we have I think we're up to 6 different brands that are going to be here doing demo rides. So I know for sure BMW is here; they're a presenting sponsor. CF Moto, Yamaha's here, Suzuki, I believe, is here, and a few others that are going to be here, all running demo rides that are all part of your $45 ticket to get in. It's $45 to get into the event. It's $22 to get in to the museum on a daily basis. But the key there is just go ahead and buy a museum membership, because that's like $66, and then you always get into the museum for free, even during, one of the other events or something like that. So that's definitely the bang for the buck, is to do that. But yeah, the event is a family-oriented event. Over the course of the weekend will be 80,000 people coming through here. And it's the sounds of two-strokes and guys ringing out their RZ350s and, and cam chain rattle of CB750s. And all that great stuff is all just, it's all happening at one time, and you've got to, just like we were talking about before, man, photographs don't do it justice. You got to be here, see it, smell it, be around it, and make memories.
In closing, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease fresh installed and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, and of course, exclusions apply. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.